So before we start, I do have a second channel. So if you are interested in more content that isn't related to anime and manga, consider going over there and subscribing. Also, if you end up enjoying this video, consider leaving a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. So I have something that I would like to admit. I have never read, nor have I ever watched Mob Psycho 100. To be entirely honest, I'm not 100% sure why. It's not like I dislike the show, it's not like I dislike the manga, it's not like I've heard negative things about it. If anything, I've only continuously heard incredible things about it, constantly. Not only from the manga front, but more specifically from the anime front, and some very great things from that anime front. I think the only reason that I could even somewhat conjure up is that the time the anime did come around for Mob Psycho 100 and everyone was falling in love with it, I was losing traction with anime. I was slowly kind of stepping back from it and either not necessarily having enough time with it or experiencing a burnout. And I think that's a pretty normal thing to experience some sort of burnout, but recently I decided to go back and give it a chance. But instead of watching the anime, which is honestly critically acclaimed, and the third season, I believe, has been announced, which is a very great thing, I decided to read the manga. Personally, I'm more of a manga person and would much rather indulge within the manga than anime. So before even going into Mob Psycho 100, I kind of knew what I was getting into. I have experienced a little bit of One Punch Man, both in the original webcomic department and the version that is redrawn by Murata, who is an incredible artist. I also have watched the first season of One Punch Man, so I guess I kind of assumed that a lot of that charm or flavor or authenticity would just translate over to Mob Psycho 100 and it would just be a parallel to One Punch Man, something very similar. And I was incredibly wrong in that department. That was just my pre-estimate, my pre-judgment before going into it, and for the most part, it couldn't be any further from it, and I am extremely happy about that. So, let's take a look. To clarify what I meant in terms of being happy about it not being a One Punch Man 2.0 or something paralleling One Punch Man has no regard or intention to disrespect One Punch Man. I actually enjoyed that show for the most part. I think you get what you signed up for, and it does have that charm and that authenticity. It's very noticeable that this is by an author known as One, and the incredible art by Murata brings it to life on an entirely different level. Seems entirely different. It doesn't have that same approach. I don't believe it's redrawn by Murata or any other artist. It's done specifically by One themselves and still continues to contribute that enthralling charm or flavor or authenticity. Mob Psycho 100 is quite literally One through and through, and because of that it feels a lot more personal. See, originally, like I said, I thought Mob Psycho 100 was just going to be some sort of One Punch Man parallel, a very simplistic teenager with psychic abilities, mixing that with comedy and some high octane fights, and you basically have the exact same story. But to my surprise, there was a lot of depth, there was a lot of nuance, there was a lot of emotion, and everything felt genuine. It's kind of difficult to frame my mindset for what Mob Psycho 100 is because it's a story that I've never actually experienced before. What I mean by this is I can't think of another story that is similar to it, other than One Punch Man obviously, but in terms of other authors or the style or the concept or how it's approached, how One as an author specifically kind of takes his characters and their simplicity from design to mindset to emotions to the comedy, and how it kind of swirls really beautifully with these massive pockets of dopamine, these high octane fights or emotional points that honestly come out of nowhere, which is kind of funny in the grand scheme of things because you know something is coming. It does indicate some sort of build up of sorts, and when it hits 100%, that's when things get serious. I think what's really smart about this approach with Mob Psycho 100, and I think why I appreciate it, is that even though this build up can seem artificial if placed elsewhere within other people's works, because it kind of gives you a guideline on how to feel and what to expect by this point, Mob is completely unpredictable. So it provides a guideline that honestly has no end in sight and you don't know when it's going to approach, but also the increments within the middle of that build up with Mob as a character himself, you genuinely don't see much of a change. If anything, the change is strictly emotional or psychological, but rarely do you see the inner workings of that. Sometimes it does show, but not enough to drastically paint a very clear picture temperature of, okay, we've gone from 25% stress to 80% stress. If anything, you might just see him sweat a little bit more or be a little bit more blank than he usually is. This is super engaging because it kind of makes you second guess yourself on how the main character feels, how Mob feels as an individual. And I know I've just kind of dived into some of the biggest qualities that I like about Mob Psycho 100, but to me, this is very valuable. This is stuff that I want to say a lot of people do not talk about when they mention or recommend Mob Psycho 100. They kind of just call it another One Punch Man, which I feel like is a disservice to Mob Psycho, especially because its strongest point isn't its comedy, isn't its action, but its everyday moments. The heartbeat of the story is its characters, the downtime, the understanding, the unraveling of these characters, because the most important thing about them is surprisingly their mental state, their emotions, how they feel, how they view the world, how they react to certain things. What do I mean by this? Take our main character, for example, Shigeo Kageyama. I apologize if I butchered that name, also known as Mob. Look at this boy, super simple. His design is goofy, he wears his extreme blank expression, doesn't really have many friends, he kind of thinks in bullet points, which I feel is a funny way to describe it, and can really be one-track minded. This boy has incredible psychic abilities. Just think of the Force from Star Wars, telekinesis, being able to lift things up and crush things and basically do everything, right? It's extremely powerful. But he has these morals, he has these rules that he follows, and that he will not break them through everything, through thick and thin, even if it would to benefit himself or benefit other people, even save other people potentially. It's very hard to break that code that he has for himself. But little by little, you'll notice things about Mob's character. So while he brings across this super genuine and simplistic, kind of comedic character in itself, his mind starts to race more and more. Because of the way people treat him, because of how he handles situations, he always ends up in a odd kind of perspective of the situation, either someone looking at him or him looking at a situation oddly, if that makes sense. And because of this, there's always like a reaction to it. There's always an effect. Maybe something goes a little bit out of control, or some accident happens, or basically a lot of poor or bad things can happen around him because of his judgment, how it's very skewed, how he can't really think about the situation from a third person perspective and more so just walk straight into the thick of it. This reaction or this effect adds to his stress. It adds to his kind of mental state, this burden, if you will. And more, this increases over time. It starts to layer on top of him, but you don't necessarily see it. So while he keeps this cool, calm, and collected face, mentally, he's kind of struggling quite a bit. And this can be shown in a lot of very nuanced type of ways. It won't outright give it to you other than the 100% build up where it starts to boil out of itself and really start to showcase what is actually built up. But you can somewhat decipher his reaction towards things or how he thinks about things specifically from his 0% to somewhere between its 50 to 80%. It's small, it's very difficult to see, but within the manga at least, it does a great job in tweaking the artwork a little bit, just a fraction, to make sure that you know something is building, something is on its way. Going back to the beauty of that, you don't know when it's going to happen, you don't know what's going to add to it. You'd expect one thing to add to it and it never actually does, or something super simple or breezy actually adds to it and it surprises you. So Mob never talks about this, he never mentions anything about it. He doesn't really have friends to express his feelings to, and his family, well, tries to do the best by them 100% all the way through. So it builds until it reaches a breaking point where emotionally and mentally he can no longer handle the burden of keeping it all locked inside, and it all comes bursting out. But the way it's represented is with his psychic abilities, with his powers, and usually it will kind of center around a very specific type of emotion. So at one point it was anger, another is hatred, another is guilt, and they will somewhat single out a pillar of emotion or mental state for it to center around, and depending on the intensity of that emotion or mental state will reflect towards his 100% abilities. At this point he becomes kind of more so unconscious, he loses sight and control of himself, and it kind of turns into a bodily instinct, kind of like pure, raw, natural instinct, if that makes sense. Even though he's aware to the situation, he's not taking in any of the information. He is subconsciously doing the things that he is doing because he is emotionally and mentally overloaded at this point. For me, this is honestly kind of tragic. It's beautiful, it's extremely well conceptualized, and it's handled with a lot of care, but it's tragic in the sense that it paints a pretty brutal image, and one that can be very relatable for people, which kind of sounds weird to say when you think of Mob Psycho 100 or One Punch Man specifically, but there is a lot of great metaphors or a bunch of symbolism that helps kind of connect these dots to make it more relatable. I like the idea that the author doesn't fully go into this category, nor do I think it is actually the intended direction or interpretation for it, but I like that it can be interpreted that way. It's not fully fleshed out and played upon, and as much as I would love it to be that way, that's not necessarily the intended focus. It's more so just the generalized concept working well with another concept, and you can tell that the architecture of that concept is important because it's replicated through a lot of other characters. Mob's brother Ritsu is a prime example, someone that plays a reverse to Mob, a parallel but in the complete opposite direction. Funny enough, you actually get a massive portion of Ritsu's character, his growth, and the understanding for his kind of mental and emotional situation regarding his abilities very early within the story. It actually jumps completely away from Mob as a character and focuses on Ritsu for a massive portion of it, which is a pretty dangerous thing to do for mangas or storytelling in general, jumping away from your main character. But in this case, because Ritsu and Mob are incredibly similar but also entirely different, it works extremely well. And plus it gives you a very refreshing but valuable piece of comparison in regards to information, the abilities, and how the mental or emotional build-up works, and how that links to the 100% kind of psychic ability overload. I think the beauty of all of this is that as much as it sounds like I've put a lot of severity and thought into how Mob is kind of structured in that sense, and the characters and the abilities and what they actually represent, once again, the intention behind it isn't necessarily that direction. This is more so just my interpretation of it and finding that value within it. Instead, you'll find that a lot of the characters within here actually overshadow it with comedic value. So it's not meant to be the biggest of primary focuses. It's actually kind of meant to balance itself out rather efficiently, so as a story you kind of go through it rather smoothly. Now I can't speak on the anime front, but the manga is super simple. The artwork isn't insanely crazy unless it needs to be, which when it is absolutely incredible, but 80% of the time it's usually just very thin and simplistic lines, and it has this charm and authenticity to it which is really beautiful. It might be unpleasant for some, but I found myself rather liking it, and worked extremely well to play as this point of reference for when things got extreme, when the moments got very massive and articulated with all of this emotion and mental struggle. You can see the contrast between those points like a night and day. These super thin lines with goofy or comedic looking characters turns into gorgeous art pieces with these crazy abilities coming out to play, with the character figure themselves being very grotesque and warped and kind of skewered emotionally and all over the place, and very interpretive in that regard, and it's just incredible to witness. And the fact that it jumps so effortlessly between those points and back is incredible. In that vein, it may feel a little bit repetitive for people, but something that you can definitely get behind. It does have a lot of information that it provides, a lot of dialogue, a lot of generally normal conversations between its characters, but because of that comedy within there, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of comedy, a lot of people can still find great enjoyment within it. Mob is a character that is just lovable by all regards. Reagan, apologies if I pronounce his name wrong, it brings in this very enigmatic personality, someone that stands out a lot because of how they act and how they perceive things and what they actually do. It doesn't help that he's inherently confident with everything that he says and does, and because of that confidence, you'd never really see his determination waver. So a lot of it kind of translates over to Mob, or teaching Mob specific things, kind of like a fatherly figure in that regard. And Mob takes very small bits and pieces, but very vital bits and pieces from Reagan and his teachings, and how that that correlates to Mob's psychic abilities and what he can and can't and shouldn't probably do. Ritsu is equally one of my favorites within the manga alongside Mob. I think they're a great kind of dynamic or balance between one another, especially his whole arc within the manga is very quick to kind of go in this very sinister direction. I do wish there was more time given to it, but I enjoyed everything that we got from it. Teru is another great example of someone that balances out the main story and kind of has this great dynamic with everyone because of how confident or cocky he is, but he gets belittled by Mob, which I think is the funniest thing about it. So after the encounter that they have, they actually start to work together and befriend one another, and they make a really great team. And Teru teaches Mob a lot of great things. See, Mob absorbs a lot of other people's traits and teachings, and he tries to decipher it for himself to create his own identity, to make his decisions a little bit easier. And because of that, sometimes it becomes extremely warped, which leads to that 100% overload. All of his psychic abilities come out to play and everything comes crumbling down. But then it resets back to the identity of Mob and how he is, but he learns progressively. It's not a clean slate, but somewhat of a next step for him. I think I've definitely rambled on about Mob Psycho 100 a little bit too long, but I honestly enjoyed everything from it, and I didn't think I actually would. I know a lot of people aren't going to like me using this title because I have been using it a little bit too much lately. I apologize, but to be honest, I was genuinely wrong about it. I was majorly or severely wrong. I just thought it was going to be another One Punch Man with psychic abilities, and it couldn't be any more further from that. I can only assume in the positive of ways, just based on the reception that I've heard from it, that the anime for Mob Psycho does a great job to bring that charm and authenticity to life. Because it's very specific within the manga, it's very detailed. And I assume it can easily translate well to anime, especially with that comedy and the downtime and the kind of slice of life equivalent that is merged within there. In that sense, it feels very genuine and there's a lot of curiosity that goes behind it. It makes you keep wanting more and more from it just to see where it goes, to see how far it potentially spirals out of control and what characters are going to overload next. Honorable mention goes out to Dimple within the manga. He becomes a very massive, I guess, kind of guardian angel in a sense. Angel, devil, however you want to put it. He does lead Mob into some very weird situations, but he is also the primary actuator for Ritsu's character arc, which is incredible through and through, and I appreciate that. I really enjoyed it. And without Dimple, that arc wouldn't have been as successful. It makes a lot of sense with Ritsu thinking he's very intelligent, and he is very intelligent, but when you have Dimple who is promising him things and manipulating him, it kind of goes in a very odd and wild direction, which leads Ritsu down this pretty dark path that isn't necessarily himself. It is, but it isn't, and there's a lot more detail there, but don't really want to give away all too much detail because the beauty of it is experiencing it, which I would highly recommend. I know the artwork will not be for a lot of people, but I promise you it has charm, it has flavor, it has that spice. And when the moments get very incredible, very wild, very intense, you will not be disappointed. If I use the thumbnail that I want to use for this video, this is from the manga. And I'm not sure if Murata drew this specifically, this one panel for this manga, or if this is One's true potential, the author. I'm not sure. It does kind of look like Murata's artwork, to be honest, but still, it's in there. That's all that matters. And it's for those extremely intense moments, and they deliver very effectively. I would 100% you read Mob Psycho 100, or at least watch it. I'm sure there's enjoyment in every single regard for you there. Endtime. So welcome to the end of the video. I would like to know how you feel about Mob Psycho 100. Have you read the manga? Have you watched the anime? Are you excited for season 3? I've only ever heard positives about it, so I would love to know how you feel about it. Let me know down below. With all of that, I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Leave a like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.